The town hadn't changed much in 10 years. Same cracked sidewalks along Main Street, same smell of sawdust drifting in from the mill, same slow drawl in the way people said good morning like they were measuring your worth before deciding if you deserved one. The conference room inside Solberg Timber and Mills felt just as Reagan remembered: too much mahogany, too little air. Her boots echoed slightly as she stepped inside, drawing 3 sets of eyes that didn't bother to hide their judgment. Her mother, Janice, gave a brief, brittle smile that never reached her eyes. Her father, Richard, remained seated at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. And Kellen, her older brother by 2 years, sat like a man who'd already won the game and was just waiting for the trophy to be handed over. Reagan sat without speaking. She didn't ask how they were. She didn't comment on the weather or the renovation to the conference room's back wall. She simply folded her hands in her lap, eyes calm but distant, like someone attending a funeral they hadn't wanted to go to. She was 38 now and looked it in all the best ways, weathered not from age but from exposure to rain, to sunlight, to hard truths. An environmental engineer by training, Reagan had spent the last decade working with land conservation teams in Alaska, Montana, and eventually Central Oregon. She wasn't the kind of person who wore power suits or heels. She wore corded bracelets from former field teams and a sun-faded jacket with frayed sleeves. "You look tired," her mother said after a long beat. "I am Reagan," replied simply. The meeting began without ceremony. Richard cleared his throat and opened a thick manila folder already resting in front of him. "We're here today to formalize the next stage of this company's legacy." He began, his voice low and clipped. "Solberg Timber and Mills has survived 3 generations of economic hardship, policy changes, and environmental pushback, and it will survive into the next generation because we're placing it into steady, loyal hands." Kellen nodded, smug but quiet. Richard continued, "Effective today, Kellen Solberg will assume full ownership of Solberg Timber and Mills, including the mill site, forest leases, rolling assets, water rights, and executive decision-making authority." Reagan didn't flinch. "Of course," her mother added, "this has been the plan for a long time. Kellen stayed. Kellen built. And you, well, you chose a different path." Reagan kept her gaze on the table. The grain of the wood ran smooth under her fingertips, too polished, too artificial. She traced one line with her nail until her father's next words broke the silence. "You walked away," he said, staring directly at her now. "You don't get a legacy you didn't build. You made that choice, and we respected it. But that means you earn your own now." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Reagan stood slow and quiet, chair legs scraping gently across the floor. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag and offered no response. Her pulse had started to beat in her ears, but her face betrayed nothing. She had trained herself long ago not to show reaction, at least not in front of them. She was about to turn toward the door when a new voice interrupted. "There's one more document," said Mr. Ellison, the estate attorney, who had remained silent until now. He was seated near the end of the table, gray suit, perfectly pressed wire-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of his nose. He reached into his leather briefcase, extracted a sealed folder, and placed it gently on the table. Everyone looked at it. "What is that?" Richard asked. Ellison's voice remained even. "Per the instructions of Walter Solberg, this envelope was to be presented only after the primary transfer of business assets was completed. It is notarized and time-stamped, your father's final directive." Richard's brow furrowed. Walter's will was already processed. "This isn't the will," Ellison clarified. "It's a private document, legally binding nonetheless." Kellen leaned forward, frowning. "What does it say?" Ellison didn't answer. He turned toward Reagan. "Ms. Solberg, your grandfather requested that this be handed to you directly." Reagan hesitated, then stepped forward. She took the envelope, heavy and warm from the light above. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and unmistakably familiar. Her grandfather had always used this kind of stationery, slightly textured with faint flecks of fiber. The handwriting on the front was blocky and careful. For Reagan, to be opened when they finally remember you exist. She blinked, her throat tightened. She didn't look at the others. "Go on," Kellen said, impatient. Reagan opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a folded letter and a set of documents held together with a single brass fastener. She read the first line, then again. Her hands went still. "What is it?" her mother asked. Reagan raised her eyes. Her voice came out low, almost quiet. "It's a land deed." Kellen frowned. "What land?" Ellison spoke again. "The property where the mill currently operates, including the eastern access road, the riverfront timber rights, and the easement into Black Rock Canyon, was never legally transferred into Richard Solberg's name. The deed remained under the original conservation trust created by Walter Solberg and his granddaughter, Reagan." The silence that followed felt cavernous. Richard stood abruptly. "That's not possible. That land is the company's operational hub. I've signed leases, contracts. That land has been ours for decades." Ellison didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Mr. Solberg, you've assumed control without finalizing the legal ownership. The original trust was designed to revert full control to Ms. Reagan Solberg upon Walter's passing, unless challenged within 90 days of his death. That deadline has passed." Janice looked pale. Kellen's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Reagan placed the envelope on the table, her fingers now steady. "You told me to earn my own," she said quietly. "I did." Ellison cleared his throat again. "There is also a second portion." He reached into his briefcase once more. "A USB drive," he said. "Walter left an audio message when he recorded the week before his final hospitalization. He asked that it be played in this room today." Richard's hand went to his temple. Janice sank into her seat. Kellen muttered something under his breath. Reagan didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply sat back down, rested her hands on her lap, and waited. The room was still. The storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. Reagan unfolded the letter with a stillness that wasn't calm so much as practiced. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the page in thick, even strokes, each word deliberate, each line pressed into the paper like he'd known it needed to last longer than he would. Mr. Ellison remained quiet as she read, the others watching her with a mix of confusion and unease. She didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, holding the paper the way she used to hold saplings, lightly but with care. "To my granddaughter Reagan Elise Solberg," it began. "If you're reading this, then they finally forced your hand. I'm sorry it had to happen this way, but I know you well enough to trust you wouldn't have come unless they gave you no choice." Her chest tightened. "I know what they've told you. I know how they've tried to make you feel like you were always the odd branch on a straight tree. But here's the thing about trees. Sometimes the ones that bend in new directions find the sun first." She stopped reading aloud. That line sat in her chest, heavy and warm like a hand placed gently over her heart. She blinked, glanced up at her father. His arms were crossed so tightly it looked like his elbows might snap. Her mother's lips were drawn into a thin white line. "There's more," Reagan said quietly. She passed the letter to Mr. Ellison, who adjusted his glasses and resumed where she left off. "Effective immediately per the terms of the Conservation Trust I established in 1983, all controlling interest in the Solberg timberlands totaling 197 acres, including the mill site access roads and riverfront zones, is hereby transferred solely to Reagan Solberg. These terms are final and irrevocable as outlined in the Trust's original structure and reconfirmed via amendment dated March 18th, 6 months prior to my passing." Richard sat back slowly, color draining from his face. Kellen looked from the letter to Ellison and then to Reagan, his voice rising. "This is absurd. He was in and out of hospitals by then. You're seriously telling me he made a massive legal change while on oxygen?" "He was of sound mind," Ellison said evenly. "The amendment was signed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses, both of whom submitted statements confirming his clarity and intent. There is video documentation and a medical clearance filed with the notary public." Kellen's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up. "This is a setup. You manipulated him. He didn't even like talking about the business in the last year. He wouldn't have done this without being pushed." Reagan raised her eyes. "I didn't know," she said, voice steady. "He never told me." Ellison nodded. "She's telling the truth." This document was filed privately and securely per his instructions. Reagan was not informed until today. But why would he give her the land, Janice asked almost to herself. She left. No, Reagan said softly. I was pushed. Ellison laid the second document on the table. A color-coded map sat beneath the deed, a precise overlay showing the company's physical operations, the forested boundaries, the main supply routes, the water extraction points. You'll notice he said that the majority of Solberg Timber's infrastructure exists on land you do not legally control. Without an easement or access agreement, the company cannot operate. Kellen stared at the map like it might rewrite itself. You can't be serious. She gets to just block us out. Hold the whole business hostage because Grandpa decided to be dramatic on his deathbed. It's not about blocking you, Reagan said. It's about what he believed the land should be used for, and maybe finally what he believed I could do with it. Richard rubbed his temples. Do you even know what you've just walked into? That land isn't just trees and birds. It's payroll, equipment leases, multi-year vendor contracts. You take away our access and you don't just hurt us, you hurt this entire town. Ellison's tone remained neutral. There are ways forward. Ms. Solberg is now in a position to negotiate terms of access. But those terms will reflect her ownership. Kellen scoffed. This is revenge. No, Reagan said again, calm but firm. This is inheritance. You just thought I didn't have one. A long silence settled over the table. Ellison broke it by sliding over a flash drive. This contains the legal documentation survey maps, audio recordings, and statements verifying Walter Solberg's intent. You are entitled to copies. But the original documents remain in the possession of the trust's executor, Ms. Solberg. Janice's eyes were shiny, but she didn't speak. Richard looked like he'd aged a decade in the past 10 minutes. Kellen, for once, had no quick comeback. Reagan took the folder and stood her breath steady now. If you'd like to use the Mill Road, I'll have my conditions ready by next week. You can reach me through the trust office. Or not. That's your choice. She paused, then added, You told me to go earn my own. I did. You just didn't know you helped build it. As she walked toward the door, Mr. Ellison gathered his papers without a word. Outside, the late afternoon light poured through the tall windows warm against the wood-paneled hallway. Reagan didn't rush. Her boots made the same soft echo they had when she'd arrived, but the weight beneath each step had changed. Behind her, a legacy she'd been told didn't exist was unfolding. Ahead of her, something unnamed waited, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like exile. It felt like foundation. The USB drive was labeled in her grandfather's handwriting, for Reagan, keep this with the trust documents. It was tucked behind the letter in the folder almost as an afterthought, though Reagan knew her grandfather didn't do afterthoughts. Every detail had purpose. Every silence he kept had weight. She didn't plug it in that day. Not yet. Not while the echo of Kellen's accusations still hung in her ears. Not while her father's voice, half threat, half wounded pride, lingered in the hallway behind her. She waited until she was back at her rented cabin at the edge of McAllister Ridge, where the only sounds were the whistle of wind through pines and the distant knock of branches brushing the tin roof. It was a simple audio file time-stamped 6 months before his death. No video, no theatrics. Just his voice, deep a little slower than she remembered, but steady, grounded. If you're listening to this, he began, then I guess your father went through with it. Or your brother. Doesn't much matter which. I suppose it's both. Reagan sat down slowly, laptop balanced on her knees, breath held tight. I know they told you your ideas would ruin this place, the recording continued. That sustainability was a fancy word for gutting what worked. But I watched you. I saw the way your face changed when you talked about soil, about the water table, about using this land like it had a future, not like it was a bank to be emptied. He paused, and she could almost hear him shift in his chair. She pictured the old study with its oil-stained floorboards and that lamp with the crooked shade. He always kept it dim in there as if brightness made it harder to think. I wanted to tell you then, about the trust, about what I'd set up. But you were already so far from this place, and I knew what it cost you to stay gone." Her hands curled into fists resting against her thighs. He had seen, even when she thought no one had. The audio played on. "I still remember that day 4 years ago, spring thaw barely over. You came to the meeting room with those binders, those charts, so sure you could show them a better way. Do you remember what your father said? 'This isn't a classroom, Reagan. This is a business.' And Kellen. He laughed like you'd suggested planting daisies in the clear cuts. Yes, she remembered. It had taken her 3 months to prepare that proposal, a pilot reforestation program using native understory plants to restore soil health. She'd run models, contacted specialists, even found partial funding through a state grant. And in the span of 20 minutes, it had been dismissed, ridiculed, and finally shredded in front of her by the man who claimed to care about legacy. Her grandfather's voice grew heavier. "That same week, I found out Kellen sold off the east section of the protected grove, said it was a paperwork mislabel. But I knew it was greed. He sold it to West Range Holdings under a shell agreement. You know what they put in there now, parking lots. Fuel storage. There's a runoff line that bleeds straight into the creek." Reagan felt heat rise in her chest, not just from anger, but from confirmation. She had felt something was off back then, even after she left. There were whispers, odd line items in public land reports, but no one ever admitted to it. Kellen made sure of that. "I tried to call you after that," her grandfather said. 3 times. Once from my home line, twice from the mill office. Janice said you were overseas. Richard said you'd changed your number. But I didn't believe it. I knew what was happening. I just didn't know how deep the lie had gone. Reagan's breath caught. She had never changed her number. She still had the same voicemail greeting from grad school. The last time she'd tried to reach her grandfather was the summer before his first hospitalization. She'd shown up at the ranch. Kellen had opened the door and told her flatly, "He's sleeping. Doesn't want visitors." She'd left a note anyway. No one ever mentioned it. "I'm sorry I didn't try harder," the voice said now, "that I trusted them to keep the bridge open. But I built something for you, Ray. Something that won't be so easy to bulldoze." There was a soft scratch of paper in the recording. A page turning. Maybe even the deed itself. "I put your name on the trust when you turned 21. You didn't know, but it was already yours in spirit. I watched you draw diagrams in the dirt when you were a kid, try to calculate erosion on the driveway. I saw the questions you asked that made your teachers nervous. A laugh, soft and tired. You were always the future, even if they couldn't see past their profit margins. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner." The recording ended. No goodbye, no dramatic last words. Just the quiet stop of someone who'd said exactly enough. Reagan sat still for a long time, laptop screen gone dark, wind hissing gently outside. She felt grief, yes, but not the kind that dragged. This grief carried shape clarity, like a trail finally visible after years of overgrowth. She leaned forward and rested her elbows on her knees. All this time she'd carried a version of the story that made her the runaway, the disloyal daughter, the idealist who'd turned her back on legacy. But it had been them. The edited records, the rerouted calls, the pieces missing from conversations she hadn't known were censored. They hadn't just pushed her out. They had rewritten the narrative and handed it back to her like it was truth. She stood and crossed the room to a wooden file box tucked in her duffel. She pulled out a half-filled notebook from her days with the watershed team pages marked with field notes, sketches, potential project ideas. She flipped to a blank page and wrote 4 words at the top. Begin with what's true. Then under it, another build from there. She closed the notebook, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark line of pine trees stretching toward the mountains. Somewhere out there within the boundaries of the land her grandfather had quietly placed in her name was the exact spot where she'd once helped him plant a sapling during a late spring snow. She couldn't remember if it had survived. But now she had a reason to go find out. She didn't need their permission. She had her own map now, and the path it charted didn't lead back. It led forward. The call came less than 48 hours after the estate meeting. Reagan had expected it. Still, when she saw her father's name flash across the screen, her chest tightened like a reflex. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice steady clipped. "Reagan." "You've made a mistake," Richard said. No greeting, no pause. "We're giving you a chance to walk it back before this gets ugly." She was standing by the window of her cabin, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd barely touched. Outside, the ridgeline was caught in early frost. The light made everything look sharper. She watched a squirrel dart along a fence rail, then disappear into the pines. "What exactly am I walking back?" she asked. "You know damn well," he snapped. "That land was always part of the company. Just because he signed some backdoor trust doesn't mean you get to shut down 30 years of operations." Reagan didn't speak. She let him stew in his own momentum. Kellen's voice came through next. He must have been on speaker. "This whole thing smells like manipulation. You were gone for 10 years and suddenly you show up with a deed and a recording. We're filing for injunction first thing Monday." Reagan raised the mug, took a slow sip, then set it down. "You told me to earn my own," she said. Calm. "I am." Silence. Then her father's voice again colder. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," she replied, eyes still on the tree line. "You did that. I'm just not pretending anymore." She ended the call without waiting for whatever came next. By noon, Mr. Ellison had arrived at the cabin. She didn't ask how he'd found the address. He was a good attorney. It was part of his job. He carried a hard-sided briefcase and wore the same expression as he had at the estate meeting, composed, alert, and perhaps faintly curious. "There's something else," he said after they sat papers between them. "Your grandfather anticipated they might try to contest your control of the trust, so he left a secondary structure and insurance of sorts." Reagan folded her arms. "Go on." Ellison opened a document sleeve and removed a short letter on embossed stationery, again her grandfather's handwriting. This one was more recent. "He admired your work with the tribal co-op in Warm Springs," Ellison said, "specifically the youth-led reforestation initiative you helped launch. He followed your reports apparently from the start." Reagan blinked. He never mentioned it. He read everything Ellison said. Even printed the online publications. "I have a stack in my office, all marked with notes in the margins." Reagan looked down at the page now in her hands. It was a directive, short and formal. Walter Solberg had established a separate nonprofit trust, the Restoration Reserve Foundation, with full fiduciary and operational rights granted to one Reagan E. Solberg. It had a startup endowment of $2.3 million, placed in escrow, released only upon confirmation of her legal control over the original trust lands. "He created this 2 years before he died," Ellison said. "Didn't tell anyone. He didn't want them to get ideas about rerouting the funds or attaching the foundation to the timber operation." Reagan's throat felt tight. She read the last line of the letter again, this time silently. "Let them fight for what they've built. You build what matters." She set the letter down and pressed a thumb to her temple. "I don't even know where to start." "You already did," Ellison said, then paused. "He mentioned you might say that." She gave a small laugh, dry but real. "Of course he did. The documents were clean binding and thorough. There were no strings, no co-signatories, no board of directors packed with family loyalists. It was hers. Entirely." Later that evening, after Ellison had gone, Reagan sat outside with the papers spread across the porch table. A soft wind moved through the trees like breath. In the fading light, the documents looked unreal, like something printed from someone else's life. But the truth was now too loud to ignore. They hadn't just underestimated her. They had tried to erase her. And in secret, the one person who saw the whole thing coming had placed every tool in her hands to resist it. She thought of Kellen's voice on the phone. The disbelief, the outrage. For so long, he'd operated under the assumption that family loyalty meant obedience. That being chosen was a reward for compliance. Reagan had never been compliant. She'd questioned, challenged, refused to play nice. And for that, she'd been cast as a traitor. But now the roles had shifted. She wasn't just a name in the trust. She was the owner of the land that held their entire operation hostage. She was the director of a foundation built to reroute power away from extraction and into renewal. And more than anything, she had proof. Proof that she had mattered all along. She lit a small fire in the metal pit by the porch and watched the smoke rise into the blackening sky. Around her, the forest whispered not as enemy, but as something waiting to be heard. Later that week, the first formal letter from Kellen's legal team arrived. It was slick corporate dismissive, demanding an immediate halt to all activities on contested land. It referred to her grandfather's directives as informal preferences and threatened litigation if Reagan refused to yield access to the disputed parcels. Reagan placed the letter beside her grandfather's handwritten trust and took a picture of both. She posted it without comment to the foundation's social media page under the heading, "When Legacies Collide, We Choose Restoration." The response was swift. Former forestry interns, conservationists, local advocates began tagging the post. Some shared memories of working alongside Reagan on watershed projects. Others posted side-by-side photos of erosion maps and habitat loss timelines from the timber years. But the most surprising messages came from within her own town. One from a woman who had worked in accounting at the mill. "I did payroll under 3 Solberg men. You're the only one who ever asked how much we paid the cleanup crews." And another from a biology teacher at the high school my students are watching. "Don't back down." Reagan saved each note, pinned them next to the stove where she'd once kept her grandfather's recipe for cedar-roasted trout. Now, the wall was changing, becoming a tapestry of quiet revolution. The final shift came on a Tuesday morning when she received a registered envelope marked with the state seal. Inside, the Department of Environmental Quality had confirmed the receipt of her submitted complaint and had opened a formal investigation into the company's historic practices. The inquiry would cover logging boundary violations, misreported restoration credits, and the land transfers under dispute. She stared at the letter, heart steady. For the first time since the call, she allowed herself to feel it. Not rage, not vengeance, just momentum. The battle lines had been drawn. But for once, she wasn't the one stepping onto someone else's field. This time, the ground was hers. It didn't take long for the story to spread. In towns like this, the forest held its own version of social media. Loggers talked over their coffee thermoses at the mill gates. Truckers passed the word down 2-lane highways. And by day 3, even the woman at the bakery counter was asking if Reagan was really planning to shut the whole thing down. She didn't correct them. Not because it was true, but because trying to explain the nuance to people who'd already made up their minds was like pouring water through burlap. She spent those first days walking the boundaries of the trust land with a surveyor from the local co-op, Harold Sanchez, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a reputation for saying exactly what he meant. He didn't ask about the family. He only asked for the coordinates and carried a clipboard with the same reverence most men reserved for church bulletins. "You know what this grove is?" he asked as they stepped through a stretch of old-growth Douglas fir near the western rise. She nodded. "Yeah, I mapped it with my grandpa once. He said it was the only stand he refused to cut." "He told me that too," Harold said in 2009. Same words. He didn't elaborate, just kept walking. By the end of the week, the Regional Land Use Council had called an emergency session. Reagan received the notice via email request for testimony regarding operational permits associated with Solberg Timber and Mills. Scheduled review 10 a.m. Thursday. Open to public comment. She didn't reply. She wouldn't be attending. Instead, she forwarded the notice to Mr. Ellison with the subject line, "They'll speak louder than I ever could." And they did. Marcy Ipatewa, a tribal liaison from the Warm Springs Confederation and longtime partner in Reagan's youth forestry program, gave a 10-minute statement that aired live across the county's public access channel. She wore her hair in a tight braid down her back and held the microphone like she was holding a promise. "This land has been part of our story since before any of the Solbergs put a stake in it. Reagan's the only one in that family who ever walked it without acting like she owned it. There were others, too. Former interns, forestry techs, a retired biology teacher from the local high school who recounted how Reagan had volunteered every spring to help students catalog watershed samples. And yet for every voice raised in her defense, another came through the noise with venom. Kellen went on KBKR 1490, a regional radio station with a loyal following among the town's old guard. His voice was clear and composed, like someone who'd practiced sounding reasonable. My sister has chosen to use legal loopholes to paralyze a business that employs over 70 families, he told the host. She claims it's about conservation, but she never once consulted us before pulling the rug out from under our feet. It's personal. She's holding the family hostage to settle a decade-old grudge. Reagan heard the clip secondhand. She didn't listen to the full interview. She didn't respond to the media requests that started hitting her inbox the next day. She simply archived them. Her silence became its own kind of voice, but not everyone stayed silent. At the next town hall meeting, packed into a converted firehouse with standing room, only someone unexpected stood up during the public comment period, a high school junior named Lily Tran. Reagan recognized her immediately, even though she hadn't seen her in almost a year. Lily had been one of the brightest students in Reagan's environmental science summer cohort. Quiet, detail-obsessed. The kind of kid who underlined and color-coded patterns and got nervous speaking above a whisper. But that night, Lily didn't whisper. My name is Lily Tran. I'm 17. Last year, I was part of the Youth Watershed Initiative run by Ms. Solberg. She paused, glanced around the room, then lifted her chin. Before that, I didn't know what runoff erosion meant. I didn't know how to collect field data, or that my town's soil nitrate levels were above state averages. I just thought forests were trees and companies knew what they were doing. Someone coughed. Another shifted in their metal folding chair. But then I learned how to read impact reports. I saw maps that don't show up in press releases. And I started to understand that legacy isn't about keeping something alive just because it's familiar. It's about making it better. Ms. Solberg taught me that. And she never asked for anything in return. Reagan sat in her cabin that night watching the live stream replay on a tablet with cracked edges. When Lily finished speaking, the camera panned briefly across the crowd. Some people clapped, others didn't. But no one looked away. She closed the tablet and leaned back into the worn cushions of the couch. Outside, the forest was awake, the rustle of dry branches, the faint whistle of wind, the low creak of trees, reminding the world they were still standing. Her grandfather's words came to her then, unbidden, but welcome. Let your work speak when your voice is ignored. She wasn't sure if she was winning anything, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone, and that she thought was more than enough for now. The knock came just after 11. Not the polite kind. It was heavy uneven, like someone wasn't entirely sober, or maybe just angry enough to forget how wood carried sound through night air. Reagan set down her pen and looked up from her journal, the lamp beside her, casting a pale circle across the cabin's kitchen table. The fire had burned low in the stove. Outside, the cold had settled in thick, silencing even the pines. She didn't need to check who it was. She already knew. Kellen. She opened the door slowly, deliberately. He was standing on the porch, swaying slightly, breath-fogging the air. His coat was unzipped shirt, wrinkled and half untucked like he'd dressed in a rush or a rage. The smell hit her first whiskey and sawdust, the same blend she remembered from years back when their father would come home from the mill and slam doors just to remind the house who held the power. But it wasn't just alcohol. It was desperation. It clung to him. You're not even going to invite me in. He slurred, but the edge in his voice was sharper than the alcohol. I didn't ask you to come, Reagan said, stepping aside anyway. But I'm not the one who slams doors anymore. Kellen brushed past her boots, leaving streaks of damp on the floor. He looked around the cabin like he was casing it, searching for weakness maybe. There wasn't much to critique. A few field notebooks, stacked reference books, a travel mug still half full on the counter. The wall held a large topographic map of the watershed, flagged in red where invasive species had overtaken the native fir. No family photos, no framed diplomas, no hint of sentimentality. He scoffed quietly, then turned to face her. This what you wanted? His eyes were red, not from crying, but from exhaustion. You win, Reagan. You burned the whole thing down. Grandpa's land, the permits, the public opinion. It's all yours now, Queen of the Ashes. She didn't flinch. You're drunk. Go sleep it off, Kellen. No, you don't get to play the noble victim now. You were always bitter, always waiting to swing the axe the moment someone else's back was turned. I didn't swing anything, she said quietly. You just finally ran out of places to hide what you'd already broken. His laugh was bitter. That's rich. You walk in with your trust fund and your foundation and act like you're better than the rest of us. You weren't here, Reagan. You don't know what it took to keep things running while you were off hugging trees and playing savior with the tribes. I know what you sold to keep the lights on, she said, voice flat. His jaw twitched. You don't know anything. I know you pushed into illegal cut zones. I know you lied to investors, falsified runoff logs, buried warnings from the watershed engineers. And I know her voice dropped you sold land you never had the right to sell. Kellen's face went pale, then flushed a sickly red. That was Dad's call. We needed the cash. The Grove wasn't producing. I'm not talking about the Grove, she said. Silence dropped between them like a felling wedge. You sold access to the burial site, she said. Didn't you? Kellen blinked. For a moment, his entire body sagged like someone had punched the air out of him. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Then quietly, like the words hurt coming out. It was just one parcel. No one was using it. It was a buffer zone. We needed the money. I didn't think you didn't think because you didn't care, she said. Not about what the land meant, not about the people buried there, not about anything but scrambling to plug the next financial leak. His voice shrank. I forged the signatures, changed the boundary maps. No one checked. They just wired the money. Reagan reached for her phone, slowly setting it on the table. The screen had been recording since the moment he walked in. The red light glowed steady. Kellen followed her eyes, realization dawning too late. I didn't plan it, she said. But the second you walked through that door with liquor on your breath and guilt in your posture, I knew you wouldn't be able to help yourself. He staggered back, nearly tripping over the rug. You set me up. No, she said. You set yourself up. I just stopped covering for you. He paced the room once, twice, hands running through his hair. You think this is justice turning me in. You think Grandpa would have wanted this? Reagan's voice didn't rise. I think he wanted the truth. You buried it. I'm just digging it back up. Kellen sat heavily in the chair across from her. He looked older, suddenly drained and crumpled under years of entitlement and denial. I didn't know how to do it without him. Without you, he said. You always made it look easy. It wasn't, she replied. I just stopped pretending it was. He exhaled hard. We were never meant to run this kind of place. Legacy, what does that even mean? A name carved into the side of a truck. It means you don't trade memory for margin, she said. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind battering the window pane. He rubbed his hands over his face, then stood. I hope you know what you're doing. I do. He paused at the door. You know? They'll crucify me. You did that yourself, she said. And this time she didn't stop him as he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. The cabin seemed to inhale after his exit like it had been holding its breath the whole time. Reagan sat down slowly. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then pressed save. She didn't even listen back. She opened her laptop, drafted the email, and attached the audio file. The subject line was simple: potential violation of state conservation and tribal lands statute. She added context, locations, forged maps, attached a scanned letter from the watershed office that had been ignored the year before. Then she hovered over the send button, thinking not about Kellen, but about every voice that had gone unheard. About the Grove. The names never carved in stone. The silence that had cost too much. And then she clicked. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. And it had just begun. The indictment made the front page of the Oregonian by week's end. It sat there in bold serif letters across a desaturated photo of Kellen stepping out of the Baker County Courthouse shoulders, hunched in a wrinkled shirt and no tie. The headline read, "Solberg Heir Indicted in Fraudland Sale Scandal." Reagan read the article once quietly. She folded it and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she rarely opened except to store maps, letters, and pieces of the past she hadn't yet decided to keep or discard. She hadn't come back for revenge. But this had arrived anyway. The charges against Kellen were numerous wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to sell protected land, and several environmental violations, including the unauthorized clearing of a protected watershed zone. One charge in particular chilled her: the desecration of a sacred burial site. The tribal council had submitted formal complaints, including decades of correspondence and a trail of forged paperwork that led straight to her brother's desk. Reagan's name didn't appear in the legal documents, but it lingered in the margins, in every headline, in every hushed conversation downtown. Kellen had confessed after a fashion. His legal team framed it as a lapse in judgment, the panicked decision of a man pushed to the brink by years of financial decline. His attorneys floated a theory that the grandfather had suffered cognitive decline when he transferred the reserve to Reagan, though they couldn't explain why the documents had been notarized twice months apart and certified by the family's own legal counsel. But it wasn't Kellen's maneuvering that shocked her most. It was her father. Vernon Solberg, who had built the company brick by political brick, emerged from silence only when the heat circled back to him. He hadn't said a word during the estate meeting, hadn't appeared publicly during the backlash. But now, as investigators began pulling emails and scanning board minutes, Vernon reemerged, this time with a defense. His statement came via a press conference. His attorney, a man in an impeccable gray suit, read it on the courthouse steps as reporters huddled under umbrellas. Mr. Vernon Solberg is in the early stages of cognitive impairment. As such, he cannot be held fully responsible for any documentation he may have signed in recent years. There is no evidence that he knowingly participated in wrongdoing. Reagan watched the stream from her laptop in the cabin, arms crossed so tightly her elbows ached. Impairment. He had driven himself to the estate meeting, argued fiercely, signed papers, reviewed spreadsheets, and interrupted the lawyer more than once to clarify financial terms. It wasn't memory loss. It was cowardice dressed up in a diagnosis. But the district attorney's office wasn't swayed. By the end of the week, 6 former employees had stepped forward with dated emails and handwritten notes, several from Vernon himself, confirming that he had not only known about Kellen's under-the-table dealings, but had approved several of them. One assistant even provided a copy of a memo in Vernon's handwriting, urging Kellen to expedite the easement sale before new regulations kick in. Solberg Timber and Mills unraveled fast after that. The board dissolved under pressure. Credit lines were frozen. Ongoing contracts canceled. Several vendors filed breach of contract suits. Investors, many of whom had long tolerated the family's opacity, finally pulled out. Within 45 days, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. 3 generations of Solberg industry undone in 6 weeks. And with that collapse came something Reagan hadn't expected. Not relief, not even vindication, but isolation. Her mailbox filled with letters, some typed, most handwritten. One scrawled in red ink on a postcard, "You were never one of us. Now we know why." Another slipped under her windshield at the grocery store. "You ruined lives. Hope you enjoy your legacy." Online comment threads teemed with vitriol. "She always thought she was better than us. Portland came back and turned on her own. Bet she's lining her pockets with grant money now." But in the spaces between the hate, something else emerged. A padded envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a yellowed photo of the mill from the 1970s, captioned on the back in block handwriting, "I worked here 28 years. I kept my head down. Wish I hadn't. You did what I couldn't." Then came a letter from a woman named Helen Pritchard, the widow of a former forestry surveyor. It was handwritten and neatly folded in crisp-lined paper. "Dear Ms. Solberg, I'm not good with speeches, but I needed to tell you I watched my husband come home every day with sawdust in his boots and shame in his voice. He knew what they were doing. Thank you for doing something about it. And then one morning, a child's drawing-colored pencil on torn notebook paper was left in her P.O. box. A picture of a tree with a smiling stick figure next to it. Written above, "I want to be like you. Trees need heroes too." Reagan tacked that one to the inside of her cabin door. Because for all the noise, for all the bitterness, the truth had landed, and the land at last had been heard. The hardest part wasn't facing the town, or even the press. It was letting go of the belief that she could have repaired the legacy instead of rebuilding something entirely new. That somewhere deep down, if she'd said the right words, her father might have looked at her and seen not a problem, not a deviation, but a daughter. That dream died quietly. And in its place came something quieter but stronger. Resolve. One evening in mid-December, as frost crept along the edges of her window, Mr. Ellison called. His voice was gravel and comfort steady as ever. "They're proposing a settlement," he said, "from what remains of the board. They want access rights to the restoration corridor just for research, they claim. No commercial development." Reagan looked out across the ridge. Mist rolled over the trees like breath. "No," she said, "not yet." "They're prepared to offer quite a bit," he added. "6 figures." She didn't hesitate. "It's not about money," she said. They had decades to act with integrity. "Let the land breathe." Ellison paused, then said, "You sound like your grandfather." She didn't answer. She just watched the fog roll forward, settle, then lift again, revealing trees that no longer bowed to industry but reached upward, rooted, alive, and finally free. The first frost melted fast that morning, clinging only to the northern shadows of the pine ridge. Reagan stood at the edge of what used to be the upper lot of Solberg Timber and Mills, now a quiet stretch of hard-packed earth with tufts of grass already reclaiming the gravel. The warehouse was gone. Just the skeleton of a chain-link fence and the rusted sign remained crooked and barely hanging authorized personnel only. Funny, she thought. No one had ever really authorized her. Not when she'd spoken up at the mill meetings, not when she questioned the numbers in the land lease reports, and definitely not when she dared to challenge the family's grip on power. But now, after the indictments, the frozen accounts, the letters from workers and tribes and children, this land was hers. And not in the way the family once meant. It was hers to repair, hers to offer, hers to protect. The air was sharp with pine and cold mud, and beneath it something unfamiliar but steady possibility. At noon, she stood behind a makeshift podium, a recycled cedar plank elevated on concrete blocks. Before her sat folding chairs, rows of them filled with members of the tribal council, local farmers, forestry workers, and reporters with notepads balanced on their knees. Some were skeptical, some curious. Others simply wanted to witness what came next. Behind her stood a new sign recently unveiled. Polished wood, steel lettering cut in crisp lines. Whitestone Institute for Community Science Restoration and Environmental Justice. The name had come from her grandfather's journals. Whitestone was what he'd called the ridge as a child before the roads, before the company stamped out names in favor of numbered plots. It was his word for the bluff that caught the morning light, just right stone that shimmered like snow even in July. Some of you, Reagan began, her voice steady, knew this land as a place of profit. Some knew it as a place of memory, and many were never allowed to claim it at all. She paused, eyes meeting those of the tribal elders seated in the front row. Elder Marlene gave a slow nod. This isn't about erasing the past. It's about rewriting the future with more voices in the room this time. The applause was soft, respectful. Nothing performative, just a kind of collective exhale. As she stepped down from the podium, a voice cut through the crowd. Ms. Solberg Reagan turned. A teenager weaved her way through the press and visitors, a satchel slung across one shoulder, and an oversized press badge, clearly homemade, bouncing against her chest. It took a second, but Reagan recognized her. "Delaney," she said, smiling. She'd changed since the town hall, the girl who had spoken up with a trembling voice that still somehow silenced a room full of doubters. Her spine seemed straighter now, her eyes sharper. "I submitted my internship application early," Delaney said, breathless. "Just, you know, in case you were still looking. Reagan didn't hesitate. You're hired. Delaney blinked. Seriously, you've already proven you're brave enough to ask questions in public. That's more than most applicants. The girl grinned, pulling out a camera. Can I take your photo for the archive? Reagan nodded. The shutter clicked. That photo would later appear in a local feature story. From legacy to stewardship, how Reagan Solberg replanted a family name. In the weeks that followed, the institute took shape. Reagan met weekly with the tribal council in a clearing above the river. They stood in a wide circle, maps pinned to tree trunks with thumbtacks and wind tugging at the corners. One afternoon, Elder Marlene pointed to a shaded patch near the slope. This grove was once sacred space, a site for seasonal ceremony. Your father rerouted the access road through it in 1986. Reagan's jaw clenched. I want to return it, she said, permanently, as a memorial site. Educational use, cultural access managed under your terms. A long silence followed. Then, Elder Thomas, the quietest in the group, placed his hand on the map. You're the first one from that family to ask. By January, the legal easement was signed, 17 acres returned to tribal stewardship in perpetuity co-managed with the Institute. There were no press releases, no ribbon cuttings, just ink on paper and shared breath beneath bare oaks. In the same month, another announcement went live, the Cedar Light Cultural Grant, funded by Reagan's Foundation and the Tribal Arts Council, offering scholarships and residencies for Indigenous youth in sustainable forestry ecology and storytelling. A journalist from Eugene called to ask what the grant was meant to achieve. I want young people to know, Reagan said, that legacy doesn't have to mean inheritance. It can mean action, knowledge, place. Some names from her past resurfaced like leaves caught in late winter wind. A cousin sent a guarded message about rebuilding bridges. An old supervisor from the mill wrote, I wish I'd listened to you then. Others stayed silent. She didn't write back to all of them. There was too much to do. Each morning, she walked the Institute's perimeter trail, now lined with observation posts, native species markers, and benches carved by local students. She and Delaney would often walk together. Delaney had taken to filling 2 journals, one for notes, one for questions. You think it'll stick? She asked one morning, squinting up at the hillside. What this? Everything we're building. Reagan looked out. The land was patchy, some green, some brown, but breathing. Legacy isn't what sticks, she said. It's what keeps moving. By spring, the first round of saplings had taken root, planted by schoolchildren with gloved hands and biodegradable tags. The wind shifted differently now, less hollow, more layered. In a quiet room at the center of the Institute, Reagan kept 2 letters in a sealed drawer, one from her grandfather yellowed and soft at the folds, the other unopened from her brother. She didn't reread them often. She didn't need to. Some stories didn't need repetition to remain true. They lived in action in every class, taught every forest, mapped every kid who knelt in the dirt and said, this tree, it's mine to protect. Whitestone wasn't a redemption story. It was a beginning, and Reagan had never been more certain something strong could still be reshaped. It was a windless morning in early March, nearly a year to the day since the final contract for the Whitestone Institute had been signed. Reagan had arrived earlier than usual, intent on prepping for the visiting group of university students expected that afternoon. She moved quietly through the main atrium, adjusting one of the cedarwood models that explained route network mapping her mind, already flipping through grant logistics, community garden maintenance, and volunteer schedules. Then she saw the truck. Parked in the gravel turnaround, it looked familiar in the way old songs do, weathered, a little dented on the driver's side. Oregon plates coated in half-dried mud. It wasn't a forestry vehicle, and it wasn't one of the tribal council's trucks either. A man stepped out slowly, hesitating with his hand on the door for a moment too long before shutting it. Kellen. He looked thinner somehow. Not sick, just stripped down. No suit, no pretense. Just jeans, a gray flannel shirt, and boots he clearly hadn't bought for show. His hair had grown out and grayed at the temples, and the slight stoop in his shoulders was new. Reagan didn't move, not until he met her eyes through the glass. Then, without a word, she walked to the door and pushed it open. "Morning," he said. It was the same voice, but something in the tone had dropped. No challenge. No blame. I was passing through, he added unnecessarily. Didn't want to just wonder. She didn't speak yet, just stepped aside and let the door open wider. The lobby wasn't busy, just a docent behind the welcome desk and a young couple looking at the digital map of the walking trails. Kellen kept his voice low as he followed her down the main corridor. You built all this? Reagan nodded. You have research labs now? He asked, gesturing through the glass wall of a lab room where 2 graduate students were reviewing soil samples. Community-based. Most are joint projects with the council or local colleges. They walked slowly past the eastern wing, her favorite part of the institute, where the wall was mostly glass, opening up to the stretch of land where new groves had been planted. Delaney had nicknamed it the Quiet Corridor, and it was true, this section always felt still. Kellen stopped walking. I won't stay long. I know I burned the bridge. Reagan finally looked at him directly. You didn't just burn it, she said, voice calm. You sold pieces of it and blamed me when it collapsed. I know. She waited. I came to say, I'm sorry, he said. Not for what it's worth to you. Not expecting anything. The moment stretched. I didn't know, he continued, that something like this was possible. That you could take what we had and turn it into something that heals instead of consumes. He looked out the window where saplings stood in long rows under the rising sun. Dad never saw it. I didn't either. I only saw what we were told was valuable. Reagan followed his gaze. You were raised in it, she said. I was raised around it. There's a difference. He nodded once slowly. I don't want anything, he said. I just wanted to see it. With my own eyes. She nodded. You've seen it. A quiet settled over them. Not heavy, just final. I left something for you, he added, reaching into his coat pocket and handing her a sealed envelope. Her name was written in ink, careful cursive, that didn't look like his usual handwriting. I'm not asking you to read it now, he said. Or ever really. But in case one day you wonder if I ever really meant what I just said. She took it, but didn't open it. Goodbye, Reagan. And then he was gone. She watched through the window as he stepped back into the truck. No fanfare, no long glances, just the sound of gravel under tires fading into the quiet. She didn't move for a long while. There was no closure in moments like that, just a space that had once been choked by anger and grief, and now sat quiet and undecided like a field waiting for the season to declare itself. Later that night, when the building had emptied and the lights were dimmed for evening shutoff, Reagan sat in her office and held the envelope again. She glanced at the drawer where her grandfather's letter still rested. She could still remember the feel of that parchment, the deliberate curve of his handwriting, the way his words had shifted the ground beneath her feet. This felt different. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she placed it beside the other letter. Not for closure, not for curiosity. Just to acknowledge that things could change even if some bridges stayed burned. Some stories didn't need full circle endings to be true. Some just needed to be left open until the time was right. The bench was simple, unfinished cedar with a gently curved backset at the highest point overlooking the bend of the river where the current slowed to a thoughtful glide. Reagan had chosen the spot herself. There wasn't a grand unveiling or ribbon cutting, just a quiet morning with a spade a level and a small stone she'd carried in her coat pocket since the day they broke ground on the institute. The air was clean cool and laced with damp pine. Somewhere nearby, a chickadee called and the forest echoed with life again. Her grandfather would have loved it. In fact, he probably would have said something like, "You finally stopped trying to plant truth in sand," and handed her a thermos of that terrible chicory coffee he used to drink. The plaque on the bench wasn't about him, but it carried his words. Steward what you inherit. And if it's broken, rebuild it better. Reagan sat quietly listening to the river. The journal in her lap was heavy, not with pages, but with meaning. Tucked inside was the envelope Kellen had left her a year ago, still sealed. She'd thought about opening it dozens of times at night when doubt crept in. After press interviews where she was called both a hero and a traitor. After long meetings with the tribal council when rebuilding trust felt like trying to rebuild a felled redwood. But this was the first time she felt ready. Her hands were steady as she slid a finger beneath the flap. The paper was folded neatly, carefully. No date, no greeting. Just handwriting she hadn't seen since they were children trying to scribble cheat codes on paper napkins. I won't pretend I deserve anything, but I need to say this because silence was part of the damage too. I didn't understand what you were trying to do, not really. I thought legacy meant survival, not stewardship. I thought keeping the business alive was the same as keeping the family alive. But I see now what I broke along the way. You tried to tell the truth. I covered it. You planted something. I cut it down. I didn't come to ask forgiveness. I just needed you to know I finally saw it. I finally saw you. There was no signature, no postscript, no request to talk. And that in itself felt like a gesture of grace, or at least the beginning of one. She refolded the letter, returned it to the journal, and closed it gently. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. It wasn't a moment of catharsis, it was quieter than that, like the sound of the river deep under ice still moving. Voices called through the trees. Reagan stood and dusted bark from her jeans. She tucked the journal into her canvas field bag and followed the winding path back toward the clearing where 6 teenage girls waited arms full of clipboards and rolled maps, their cheeks pink from the hike. They were the first cohort of the Whitestone Institute's community science program, young women from nearby towns and reservations brought together not to memorize but to map, not to recite but to reclaim. "All right," Reagan called, waving them into a circle. "Let's see what we've got." One girl adjusted the GPS on her watch. Another cross-referenced her tree canopy sketch with the topography map Reagan had helped her print the week before. They were getting good fast, smarter than anyone gave them credit for. Then one of the quieter girls, Naomi, from the rural outskirts of town, raised her hand. She was tall and serious-eyed with an engineer's mind and a poet's timing. "Can I ask something kind of random?" Reagan smiled. "You're allowed." "Why is it called the Whitestone Institute?" The group stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause. Reagan crouched in the dirt beside them and picked up a pale river rock from the ground. She rubbed it between her fingers as she thought. "Because stone is strong," she said slowly. "But even stone, if it's been through fire or water or weather, can be shaped again. It doesn't have to be thrown away. It's not about erasing what it was. It's about choosing what it becomes." She set the rock down gently on the edge of Naomi's map. "Everything we do here, every tree we map, every history we remember, every path we redraw, it's about reshaping something that was once broken or ignored, and making it stronger." Naomi nodded. The other girls sat up a little straighter. A few scribbled that quote into their margins. Reagan stood. "All right, team, let's finish this loop before sundown." They started walking again, boots crunching softly on the path, the forest rising up around them. Reagan stayed at the back of the line, watching them laugh and pass water bottles, comparing leaf samples and arguing kindly over who had better lighting for their photos. She let the rhythm of their voices wash over her. She didn't know what Kellen would do next, or if her parents would ever speak to her again. But she knew this legacy isn't what's handed down. It's what you choose to build in its place. And here in the forest, on this land, once buried beneath the weight of other people's decisions, she had chosen something new, something that could last, something strong enough to be reshaped.